Right, I'd like to move on then and introduce the second speaker of the evening, who is Dr. Helen Roberts, who is the policy lead for non-livestock diseases, risk and science at Defra. So Helen has been a government scientist since 2017 and currently works at the Animal and Plant Health Agency, APHA, in a Defra policy team. After her BSc in zoology and PhD in human parasitology at Imperial College London, Helen accrued nearly 20 years of research and international development in various universities and non-government organisations in the UK and abroad before joining Defra in 2007. Helen is the chair of the Human Animal Infections and Risk Surveillance Group, which identifies and assesses emerging infection risks to human health. And she also sits on the European Food Safety Authority panel and animal health and welfare. So I'd like to introduce then Helen to give her topic here, which is UK policymakers needs in integrating One Health evidence and principles into pandemic prevention and response strategies. Thank you, Helen. Please share your slides.
Thank you, Louise. So, thank you very much. And also thank you for inviting me to this evening. I'm really interested to see how the panel discussion works. And it's very nice to see so many colleagues on the call as well. A few well-known names in there, certainly. So I'm just going to produce a few slides here to explain some of the work that we do in government, and particularly around that One Health area, and also where we want to go next and how we can engage with academics and researchers to improve our evidence base. Come on, move along. Right, it's not going to move. Let me see. Okay, so that was my exam question for today, and Louise has already explained that, but I'll move on to the next slide. So some of the work that we're doing at the moment is across Whitehall, and one thing that did come out of COVID that was a really obvious thing is that, well, we might talk about One Health quite a lot. We're not very good at putting it into action, and certainly even government departments can be quite siloed about it, and you could even call it at times one-sided health, where quite often as soon as you get human cases, it tends to be immediately moved over to Department of Health to run the disease outbreaks if one has happened. And it can be quite difficult then for animal health and particularly for environmental health to then become part of that whole response. So it's really important that we try and build up more of these cross-departmental working groups as much as possible. So we've got some that are working at the moment on wet markets, illegal wildlife trade, particularly with FCDO, and the work that they do abroad on that wildlife trade is really important. The biodiversity program that Defra runs is not just looking at biodiversity more generally around the world, and there's a big ODA part to that funding, but also even within the UK, we have quite poor biodiversity. And I'm sure that some of you have seen recently that we've been putting European bison back into Kent, first time in 6,000 years or something. So thinking about those sort of rewilding and what we do about that changes the interface of wildlife and humans. So that's one of our drivers that we're worried about. We've been starting some proposals for a zoonosis centre. It's a virtual centre, so it's not about a building or anything like that. It's trying to bring together all these different areas of zoonotic disease, One Health, environmental health, into one place so that we can build that, that evidence base. And we also were chairing the G7 beginning of last year. And as a result of that, we have got an international community of zoonosis experts, not just the G7 countries, but wider than that, where we share information, do a bit of updating one another on what's happening in our country or our region about zoonotic diseases, any access to risk assessments that we might have, for example. And the One Health Intelligence Scoping Study, which has been a real success about just scoping where all the One Health evidence is being held, how we can improve it, what the risk landscapes or the riskscapes look like, and how we can get hold of all that different information. And the UK has been a major funder of that work. It's done by the quadripartite, and it will be carrying on as well. They've announced some more funding for that, so it will be taken on through the next series of G7 meetings, certainly. There's a pandemic preparedness treaty, which is being agreed for at the global level, and we'll be hearing more about that in the next couple of weeks once the decisions are taken about how much of a binding legal treaty that will be. And another good thing that we've started to do now in the global health strategy, there's something called the Zoonotic Disease Action Package, and the UK is now one of the joint leaders of that action package. So we're taking forward quite a few bits of international work with that as well. Now, we've just heard very eloquently from colleagues about the number of different diseases that come from animals, and of course we've got all these different hotspots around the world. So we can look backwards and try to predict where these things will occur next, but sometimes these are not just hotspots, but it's also highlighting some of those cold spots as well. So places where surveillance is not very good, because you have to be quite careful about the amount of bias that you've got with different programs in different countries, and where haven't we got something? Where do we need to focus that we think something might arise or that could be happening before we know about it? And we've gone through not just COVID recently, but also the monkeypox infections that are now happening globally, and understanding things like how those are driven as well. But we're also trying to think about what the next major pathogen should be. So this slide I actually wrote quite a while ago, and yet we've still got monkeypox on here because this is a couple of years ago and we started putting this together, just thinking generally about the next major pathogens that could potentially become emerging threats. And we should remember that not all of the fast moving infections will become pandemic. Not all pandemics will be zoonotic, although quite a few of them are. But sometimes we're faced with smaller problems. They don't have to go across the entire world for us still to be very worried about it. And not all of them have to be given the WHO branding of being important infections, emerging infections. But some of the examples here are new vector-borne diseases. So where something could jump into a new vector, we want to understand about that. So Zika virus was always carried by Aedes aegypti, but if it can jump into Aedes albopictus, it becomes more of a problem in parts of the world where it gets colder in the winter. So Aedes albopictus can overwinter nicely, but aegypti can't. Antimicrobial resistance is something we absolutely should not take our eyes off. Respiratory viruses in general, because the transmission of them is so easy. Foodborne infections. I'm fascinated by the idea that the bite of the Texas Lone Star tick can make people allergic to meat. Are there any other weird allergenic responses out there that might arise? And any pathogen that targets fetal development in either the animals or in humans, it can spread silently and you might not see the after effects. I mean, Zika was this to a certain extent, but also new emerging animal disease of Schmallenberg, which did the same thing. So it took us a long time to recognize it was a problem, because this is all about the infection of the mother at a certain period of fetal development. And finally, how apt at this time when we're all suffering a lot from the heat is climate change, of course. And understanding the drivers for climate change is a very important part of the work that we're taking forward. Understanding vector distribution, understanding what those extreme events can do, whether you've got flooding or extreme drought in different areas, how all of these can affect new emerging diseases, and the increase in interaction between wildlife and livestock, whether you're rewilding or whether it's because humans are moving into new areas driven by the need for new land areas and so on, then there's a lot of work to be doing here. And thankfully we have well, change of government aside, but thankfully we have got some work continuing in this area. It did stop for a bit, but it's really important that we understand where researchers can help us with this, because this is not something that government can necessarily do all the work on. So how do we engage researchers and academics? Well, we recognise that we need to expand our network, and we have got various ideas of how we do it, including using some government money to have workshops where we invite people to come along and do a marketplace of what they're working in One Health at the moment. We need to keep up with the speed of change, particularly in terms of your genomic diagnostic technology. We've got a program going on at the moment, but looking at the rapid diagnostic testing, it was so successful in COVID. The COG UK program was amazing. The UK was truly world leading in our ability to get those sequences analysed as quickly as possible. And there will be actually a need for bioinformaticians in the future, because disease specialists don't necessarily know how to translate some of this complex genomic data that we're coming out with. And there's some nice UKRI funded, BBSRC funded programs at the moment, one in particular about a centre for doctoral training in environmental testing and zoonotic disease. We're really interested in any researchers who might be keen to partner in this. And this type of partnership between policymakers and the researchers, particularly in their early career, I think is really important, because for the researchers to understand where we're coming from, where we're being driven by, is part of that. And this is where my next point is quite important. So transparency of data sharing and the impact on trade bans is a whole policy area we have to be really careful about. We have GDPR, of course, anyway, in terms of our data, but also we'd love to be as transparent as possible and tell everybody about everything that we find. But that's not always the right thing to do, because it can easily impact trade bans or travel bans, and that can have different effects on our reputation as well as the economic impact of something like that. So we need to actually work really carefully with researchers and academics about how we deal with that data sharing. If you can take the example of, let's say, another laboratory in the UK started testing for foot and mouth disease or foot and mouth disease virus in meat products, and they found some positive meat products. What do we do with that information? It doesn't mean it means that we've got an outbreak happening, but equally, we don't necessarily know where it's come from. It's similar to the wastewater testing as well, where have those positive signals come from? And then finally, the drivers. So not just climate change, although that's hugely important, but changes that happen with increasing travel, increasing human-animal interactions, poor intensive farming practices. Farming can be intensified and it can be done in a good way. It can be done with good biosecurity, but where is it done in a poor way? How does that impact on animal welfare as well? Increased use of antimicrobials, all of these things can drive our zoonotic disease. So we would reach out as much as possible to anybody out there who's working in these different areas to make sure that we can bring you in and work collaboratively together in this area. Thank you.